Many people read Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and to give you a future, as a direct, personal guarantee that their circumstances will always align with their desires. This promise was originally delivered to a group of terrified exiles who had witnessed the total, violent collapse of the Judean state. These people had just survived the horrors of ancient Near Eastern warfare. They had endured starvation, military siege, and the systematic slaughter of their community by a ruthless foreign army. When we approach the Bible with the pragmatic question of, what does this mean to me? We strip prophetic texts of their historical coordinates. We reduce precise records into empty spiritual aphorisms. The book of Jeremiah serves as a crisis response document, written entirely while the nation stood in the shadow of imperial conquest. To understand Jeremiah, we have to grasp his radical theopolitical perspective. He made the scandalous claim that Yahweh himself was the one orchestrating this international crisis. Any attempt to read biblical prophecy without mapping the shifting tectonic plates of ancient Near Eastern empires will distort the text's actual meaning. In 626 BC, the international power structure fractured. A man named Nabopolassar declared Babylon's independence from the dominant Assyrian Empire. This triggered the rapid collapse of Assyrian power. By 612 BC, Babylon and its allies defeated the Assyrians and captured their capital city, Nineveh. The decisive blow came in 605 BC at the Battle of Carchemish. Babylonian forces crushed the Egyptian army, securing absolute dominance over all of Syria-Palestine. Through the lens of Deuteronomy 28, these were not random geopolitical events. They represented the activation of the covenant curses of sowing and reaping, a direct consequence of Judah's long-standing disobedience. The prophets presented a distinct mechanism for this. God was directly superintending these international troop movements, using pagan armies as instruments of divine judgment. Following his victory in 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar marched into Jerusalem and initiated the first wave of deportations, extracting Daniel and the young elite back to Babylon. Judah was demoted to a vassal state, forced to answer to Babylon and pay heavy annual tribute to the Neo-Babylonian hegemony. But Judah's king Jehoiakim made a fatal political miscalculation. He attempted to play the remaining Egyptian military forces against his Babylonian overlords, constantly weighing the option of armed rebellion. But Nebuchadnezzar finally tired of this insubordination. In 597 BC, he brought his army back, laid siege to Jerusalem, and initiated a second, much larger wave of deportations. We have precise extra-biblical attestation for this exact event. Both the biblical record and the official Babylonian chronicles independently pinpoint the capture of Jerusalem to March 16, 597 BC. In the prophetic worldview, history and theology are inseparable. God was the prime architect of the Babylonian conquest. Nebuchadnezzar then placed a puppet king named Zedekiah on the Judean throne. Zedekiah listened to military advisors who pushed him to launch a final armed rebellion against Babylon. In response, Jeremiah delivered a terrifying reversal of Israel's oldest traditions. Throughout the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan, Yahweh fought battles on behalf of his people. In this crisis, he had put on the uniform of the enemy, fighting against Jerusalem. Jeremiah made the scandalous claim that King Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan ruler, had been designated as God's servant, a title previously reserved for figures like Moses and David. To illustrate this political reality, Jeremiah walked into a diplomatic conference in Jerusalem wearing a wooden animal yoke. His message was stark: absolute submission to the yoke of Babylon equals life, armed resistance equals death. The Judean military commanders viewed this message as treason. They accused Jeremiah of deliberately weakening the hands of the troops and threw him into a cistern to die. We possess raw, extra-biblical proof of this collapsing state. These are the ruins of Lachish, a fortress city located 25 miles away, designed as the final defensive perimeter protecting Jerusalem. Archaeologists recovered military correspondence here, known as the Lachish letters. They capture the panic of commanders desperately seeking Egyptian aid and complaining about officers who are weakening troop morale, exactly as the book of Jeremiah describes. One specific dispatch reveals the terrifying tactical situation regarding the final standing fortresses in Judah. It was written on an ostracon, broken pottery used as a writing surface. The commander reports they can no longer see the signal fires of their sister fortress, Azekah. The city had fallen, meaning the siege of Jerusalem was next. The Babylonian vice squeezed shut. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's forces breached Jerusalem, knocked down its walls, and burned the temple to the ground. King Zedekiah tried to flee under the cover of night. He was captured in the arid plains of Jericho, forced to watch the execution of his sons, and then blinded before being dragged to Babylon. Judah was fighting a divine judgment, an opponent far more formidable than a conventional military force. After the dust settled, the Judeans who survived the siege and remained in the ruined homeland developed a dangerous psychological assumption. They believed that by avoiding deportation, they had proven themselves to be God's favored remnant. In their minds, the exiles had experienced God's curse, while those left in the land had secured his blessing. Jeremiah introduced the vision of the 2 bowls of figs to dismantle this myth. He delivered a massive theological shock. The good figs did not represent the survivors in Jerusalem. They represented strictly the deported exiles currently suffering in Babylon. The bad figs were the survivors remaining in the homeland, a lineage marked by God for total erasure. The final proof of this curse came when a group of Judean officers assassinated the Babylonian-appointed governor, Gedaliah. This triggered a 4th and final Babylonian deportation in 582 BC. Jeremiah reframed physical exile as the sole geopolitical mechanism engineered for Israel's biological preservation. This brings us back to Jeremiah 29:11 and the famous promise of a future and a hope. That promise came with a brutal, unalterable timeline. Before any restoration could occur, the people had to endure a mandatory 70 years in exile. This chart compares the duration of the exile to an average human lifespan, highlighting the harsh reality of a generational delay. The individuals receiving this prophecy would almost all die as captives in Babylon. The prosperity was intended for their children and grandchildren. This sobering reality directly contradicted the lies of false prophets like Hananiah, who were telling the people exactly what they wanted to hear, that the Babylonian crisis would be over in just 2 years. Jeremiah 25 provides a theopolitical pivot. Babylon itself remains subject to the cosmic moral order. Jeremiah performed a sign act where he held up a cup of wine representing divine wrath, announcing that all the surrounding nations would stagger under its intoxicating power. At the time, the Neo-Babylonian Empire seemed invincible. To suggest that this massive imperial power would fall sounded impossible. But the prophetic contract had an expiration date. After 70 years, the temporary servant status would end, and the king of Babylon would be forced to drink the exact same cup of judgment he had poured out on Judah. Prophetic literature reveals a geopolitical orchestration by a sovereign God who uses the rise and fall of absolute empires to purify a remnant through the fires of history.